Welcome to another episode of the Getting the Deal Done podcast. My special guest today is attorney Danya Shakfeh. She specializes in buy-sell deals and franchises. Welcome, Danya.
Hi, John. Thank you for having me.
So you're an attorney. You specialize in small business, buy-sell. Why don't we start with just when a seller has a business, they want to make it more attractive to the buyer, and you've worked with a lot of buyers. What should they do to make it smoother and more attractive and get to a deal?
So that's a great question. So I think first and foremost, sellers should ask that question before putting their business on the market for sale, um, because sometimes they just like throw it up, or excuse me, like they throw their like business for sale and not even ask them what will make it attractive. So, but to answer that question, but for one thing that's overlooked is having clear processes, procedures, handbooks, and basically to make the business more like a machine so that when it's transferred to a seller, or excuse me, like when the seller transfers the business to the buyer can more easily transition into the business because it runs like a machine. You don't need the seller, you don't need specific employees to continue the business after the seller leaves. And the way to do that, especially nowadays, like a lot of sellers should be looking into automation. So for example, a seller could use automation to streamline their sales processes and to make it easier to acquire clients. So as a buyer, that's a more attractive type of business where the seller has a streamlined process to acquire those clients.
Yeah, well, what you just mentioned is one of my top uh, handful of things a seller should do, and we call it an owner dependency. And
Yeah,
uh, and I
yeah.
I like to say the owner who goes to their country club or restaurant with their buddies and tells them how important they are to the business. All of a sudden, when they're selling it, they're telling everyone, "Oh, I don't do anything important.
Yeah.
I'm useless." So, owner
I
dependency is
like that
one.
term, owner dependency. I
Yeah,
always ask people, are you selling a business or are you selling a job? Because if you're selling a job, buyer will go get a job.
right.
But yeah,
Yeah,
that's a
why
nice term.
take
I'm
the
gonna start
risk?
using that.
Right. So, when there's going to be a match between a buyer and a seller, and the buyer has to make an offer. And whether you're on the buy side or the sell side, what makes a good letter of intent? Or what makes a bad letter of intent might be a better way to say it.
A bad letter of intent. Okay. So first and foremost, okay, bad letter of intent. First of all, if they don't talk about like whether it's a stock sale or an asset sale, like, oh, they're just buying the business and they're not clear about what type of deal it is, because once you're on the buy side, you want to know going in if it's going to be an asset sale or a stock sale. Because first of all, you want to know what you're buying, and then two, it's going to dictate how the buyer is going to do their due diligence. I'm going to ask you or like different questions if it's a stock or an asset sale. Obviously, like the purchase price. Sometimes I've even seen LOIs without purchase prices, and that can always be negotiated. But going in with a ballpark is always good. I mean, it's helpful too. I also don't like LOIs that are too restrictive or almost binding. And I would say this for both sides. I mean, because the LOI isn't meant to be binding. And if it becomes binding, then it can create a lot of problems as the parties try to negotiate. And also, it's just too restrictive, and it becomes stressful. Another thing that I often see lacking in LOIs are the deal breakers. Like if you're on the buy or the sell side, you want to be transparent upfront about what you know is going to kill the deal if you know that information already. Because what happens is that people will go or like they'll start negotiating, and then like for example, a seller will say, well, I really want to keep this particular asset, and the seller knew that going in but they didn't say anything, and then the buyer is like has already invested in due diligence and a lawyer, and they're like, wait a minute, I really want to buy that asset, and it just becomes difficult. So I like to have those conversations with my clients up front, like what are your deal breakers.
Okay. So what when you mentioned we get into due diligence, Tell me about the due diligence process you do with your clients when you're on the buyer side.
So most of my deals are asset deals. So we focus, of course, first and foremost, the financials. So even though I'm not the accountant and I'm not the numbers person, asking for more detailed profit and loss statements, budget reports, and projections. Um, a lot of the times buyers don't ask for that or have not asked for that already. Like all they've really asked for are like tax returns or like sales summaries. And then also any contracts that are involved. We really want to know how the seller's business makes money and the kind of relationships the seller depends on to make money. And also any contracts that may require third-party consent to make sure that the deal actually moves through. So is there a lease involved? Is there a franchise involved? That we need to get their permission to move this deal. So those are just some of the things. And also if there's any licenses that are required. So those are some of the things I'd think of off the top of my head. If you're talking about a stock sale, we want to know more about potential lawsuits and liabilities because now the buyer is actually buying those liabilities as well, like the history of the company.
Interesting point you raised about the consents from others. Uh, just got done with a client on a deal where every customer of the business had to approve the new contract.
How did that go?
Buyer. It dragged out. It took a long time.
Yeah.
We delayed it by over a month. But you mentioned lease. Lease is
Mhm.
really important, and I feel it often gets shoved to the background. And over the last 2 years, I've seen three deals that we've had some connection with not go anywhere because of the landlord.
Mm, yeah.
You're an attorney, so you deal with leases all the time.
Hmm.
Talk about leases and just handling them during the buy sell process and what the
That's a great,
bank wants. We know what banks generally want, the term
yeah.
loan covered.
I was speaking recently to, I think it was a commercial real estate broker, and he was saying that he now sees a trend where there are terms in the lease where the now the lender actually needs to approve or be part of this process for the lease to transfer to a new party. So first thing you want to see is who do we need to get involved? What applications need to start very early on because those take time and they're pending. So if a lender needs to be involved, like we ask them up front. So like on the eve of the closing, it's like, wait a minute, oh my God, we have to ask the lender if they approve the transfer of the lease. And then also I've also seen where, yeah, the the seller, or excuse me, the buyer has not timely done their application to be a tenant. So I like to start those very early on and have them run in the background while everything else is being negotiated. So everything is ready for closing on schedule.
So what do you do with the seller says, I don't want the landlord to know at this time?
What I would tell them that you're going to risk delaying the process and it's their choice. But can only advise my clients on what to do and the risks, but I can't tell them actually what to do. So I would maybe nudge them in that direction, but ultimately, if they know the risk, then I think that's really all I can do.
Mm-hmm. And what other areas do you see slowing up the process besides the consents like leases and customer contracts?
So actually going back to the financials, I see a lot because a seller will swear up and down that they have all this profit and amazing business. Like you said, it's like the seller wants to like really talk up their business before they sell it and all of a sudden things start to change. And so we had this deal actually where it was a car wash and they didn't have any P&Ls, like none. And they said they sent it and so my buyer, this is the first time that they've run a business or that they bought a business, so they didn't really know what to look for in terms of financials. All I got was an email with a list of like these like or like with a few expenses, like maybe five expenses. And I asked the buyer, I was like, "Where's water on this list? This is a car wash. I don't see anything about water." And so that actually ultimately that deal actually fell through for that very reason. But part of the delay was just not having their documents in place, or I can't find this contract. So I mean, it's not a really sexy answer. It's just have your stuff in order before you start trying to sell your business.
Yeah. And do you help? Would you help an owner if they came to you and says, "Look, I want to sell my business. Help me get things in order for a buyer." Do you work in that area? I'm not talking about process improvement or
Right.
being a CFO, but just from your perspective.
I wish my clients came to me, so I would if they did. So basically what I tell my potential sellers is here is a common due diligence checklist. This is the stuff that you're going to be asked for when you start negotiating the sale of your business. Have this stuff now and get it ready so that you're prepared and it will streamline the business. So, and then I also often work with or sometimes just refer them, depending on the situation, to a business broker like yourself that because they are more experienced in doing the actual sale of the business and often interacting with potential buyers before the lawyers get involved, having that input is also very valuable for the seller prior to actually starting the offer process.
Yeah, I think you get a lot of agreement that in people in the buy sell M&A industry that uh, owners should take time to get it ready before just flipping the switch and saying I want out. Uh,
Yeah.
Wall
And
Street
sometimes
Journal
it
many
takes two or
years
three
ago.
years. Yeah.
What was that?
No, I'm sorry. And that process sometimes may take 2 or 3 years, like to really properly prepare your business for sale. It's not something overnight, necessarily, depending on the size of the business. But
Oh yeah,
um,
because you don't you
yeah,
don't you don't change things right away and just because employees are used to doing things a certain way, customers are used to things a certain way. I think that's what we're talking about is why the Wall Street Journal, this goes back about 15 years now, but said 90% of businesses are not prepared to sell for maximum value.
that sounds about right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what other what other tips would you have from a legal perspective for buyers and sellers?
Um, from a legal perspective, one thing that often gets overlooked is tax liability, specifically the taxes and liens that could attach to assets. So a book sales notice. I'm not sure if it's like if it has a different name in California but here it's like in the state of Illinois and sometimes different counties have their own, like you actually have to provide a notice of the sale to the Department of Revenue saying, hey, like the assets of this business are going to transfer. Are there any outstanding taxes? And that could be payroll taxes or um, sales taxes. And then the Department of Revenue will do, their inspection and see if there's any taxes owed. And they will often do like a holdback and say to hold a certain purchase price amount in escrow until or those taxes are paid off. And so what often happens if that process is not done and the buyer buys those assets, even an asset sale, like they're still responsible for those taxes because now the taxes are attached to the assets. And so they might find themselves, receiving a notice of a lien and being responsible for those taxes. And that's something that's really overlooked by a lot of buyers because they think, oh, if this is an asset sale, I'm not buying the stock of the company, so I'm not, so liability is not being transferred to me. But when it comes to taxes, transfers to everybody. No one's immune.
Right. Yeah, it transcends
Yeah.
any transaction. I learned that a long time ago. And yeah, you're right. Buyers think, well, it's an asset sale. I don't have to worry about anything. There's a firewall, but the firewall is the
Yeah.
heat of taxes gets through the firewall.
Yeah. The government will always find a way to collect their money.
Yeah. Okay. Now let's uh let's finish up. You also said, I don't really work with franchises, but what do you
Mhm.
do for someone that's buying or selling a franchise? Is there anything different than an independent business?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The franchisor will typically want to vet the new franchisee because it's not now just a buyer, it's a new franchisee who is going to be stepping in the shoes of the franchise seller. And so there's usually a transfer fee that someone has to pay. It's usually around like $5,000 to cover the legal fees of the franchisor to actually vet the franchisee, and you want to have their consent. And the franchisor also wants to has to provide their required disclosures to the new franchisee. And so that process could take a while. And so having that consent early on as well is also very important. I've seen in a few situations, unfortunately, where it's completely ignored. And sometimes I think the seller doesn't realize they're in a franchise. I know that sounds weird, but they don't think of it as that relationship. And so they transfer. I mean, I see this or I saw this really, it was like a food route where, or like a trucking food route where the franchisor sells certain territories of like, of processing like different foods to different areas. So it was a smaller deal. Um, and so the seller was like, yeah, I'll just transfer my route. But I was like, no, no, you're not transferring a route, you're transferring a franchise. And so the buyer is going to spend, even if it's 30, 40K, which might not be too much money from, in M&A world, they have zero authority to actually do anything because the franchisor has not authorized this new franchisee.
Yeah. And I've seen that too with license agreements
Yeah.
that really aren't, they're not a franchise, but there's still control over who can take it over.
So that's another thing is that actually those are often still actually franchises. It's just usually that license agreement, the person who is doing the licensing, sorry, like the licensor is actually operating a franchise and they haven't done the right work to properly be a
Yeah.
franchise.
Well,
So
the franchise is very expensive. I know from personal experience,
yeah,
and
yes, it is. Yeah,
a lot of money to create a franchise. And yes, they do a
just got to be
license
careful.
agreement, and of course, everyone uses the same name and has the same product.
Yeah.
Now then, it is a franchise by another name. Uh,
Just got to be careful on the buy side too, or on the sell side too, that you're not violating any laws in that process, and it could also hurt your deal too.
yeah. Okay. Well, if you let us have any final thoughts, and then how to contact you.
So yeah, just I would say, look, just I know people don't like to spend money on lawyers, but take the time to get good counsel and get it done right so that because people buy businesses ultimately to have a better life. And you're not going to have a better life if you cheap it on yourself by either not hiring a lawyer or not hiring an experienced lawyer, like to help with this process. Do it right and then have a successful business. So those are my parting thoughts. And the best way to contact me is to call my office at 630-517-5529 or to email me at danya@motivalaw.com.
Can you spell that? The
Danya at MOTI, V as in Victor, A law.com.
Okay, thank you. And
Thank
I
you.
think what you said about having a good lawyer applies to the whole team, whether it's a banker, the accountant, someone in my position. And I will close by saying I these days tell buyers you probably want to get an HR professional to look at things
Hmm.
because there are so many, uh, we'll just say minutia in
Hmm.
what goes on with HR. And let's face it, most small businesses don't keep up on that.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, we could have a whole nother conversation about a team. I think that's a separate podcast.
All
But you're
right,
right.
Danya,
You need a
thank
team.
you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank
And
you for
again,
having me again.
this is uh, this is Danya Shakfeh in Chicago, a buy sell attorney, and this is the Getting the Deal Done podcast series.